I broke Michael in the last minute, so he didn't. You know, you are the co-chair of the supportive care committee, and you're here at the meeting, so we should probably share the podium today.
Surprise.
Surprise.
Yeah.
So we're going to sort of, actually, Michael's going to start, he'll introduce the group and the structure and the supportive care committee's sort of priorities, and then I will walk you through some of the ongoing trials, well, recently completed trials, and some ongoing trials, so more lifestyle or psychosocial intervention focus. So, Mike, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and without further ado, are you organizing?
Yes, so primarily I'm a radiation oncologist at BC Cancer Vancouver. I came to work at CCTG because of my prostate cancer interest. I've been treating prostate cancer for many years, but one day I thought I'd pop into what was at that point known as the Symptom Control Committee, and that actually is just...
We never let you go.
Exactly, exactly.
Is your microphone on?
I don't know, is it?
I believe it's not.
There we are. Is that better?
Oh, yeah.
And so, you know, what I'd like to say is it's been a great opportunity for me, and there's a huge network of investigators that I've been able to work with over the 30-some odd years I've been there. And I think it's an exciting opportunity for this group, so I'm really hoping that you'll become excited when you see what CCG has to offer here this year. There we go. So here's the history really briefly. It began in the late 70s, and it was through the vision of Dr. Joe Pater, who's still around actually, went into his 80s, although he's stepping back finally. But a lot has happened since then. The last sort of couple of decades, we've been working really hard to partner with the U.S. cooperative group system, and a lot of work has gone on to develop our capacity with tumor tissue and data repositories and investigational new drug work. It's really quite dizzying to see everything that's been accomplished. And I want to point out that that's all been done with a very kind of tight group in the central office in Kingston. It is not 400 people, and it's a really devoted group of people. That's really, and so we do the work that we do through a series of grants. The most major one comes from the Canadian Cancer Society, and we'll talk a little bit about the guided our own agenda in a little bit. But we also, until this point at least, have been getting some funding from the United States cooperative group system. That's
they refunded it. They just approved. They just approved it.
Did they really? Okay,
Yeah,
I had not heard that. So that as you can imagine, with what's going on in the United States, it's been a little tense. But we also have a grant from the CFI. Each of these things we have to, the money just doesn't arrive. We have to apply for each of these. And so this last one was the U.S. one. This upcoming year, we're going to have to do our grant for the Canadian Cancer Society, and Harriet and I were talking about that this morning. A little bit of work to do. So basically, CCTG is clearly the largest cancer clinical trials cooperative group in Canada. There are others, for example, the Ontario Cooperative Oncology Group. CCG is the largest by far. Its mission is to develop and conduct clinical trials aimed at improving the treatment and prevention of cancer, with the goal of reducing both morbidity and mortality from the disease. And its activities span the clinical trials landscape, phase 1 trials right through phase 3. We've even done some cohort studies, wide-ranging methodologies that have been applied. It's been known for developing new methods in clinical trials too, and it's been a leader, as we'll talk about in a little bit, in quality of life assessment. So a lot of really, well, I'm going to say world-leading work. And it does have global reach. We have CCTG sites in other countries. And it has 85 member sites across the country, including all cancer care facilities. But we have investigators outside of Canada as well in 6 continents. So even though we've got this tiny little staff at the central office, they're doing a lot, staying in touch with all of these folks. And so if you look at the number of patients that have been accrued during that time, thousands and thousands and thousands, and very, very engaged investigators too. A lot of enthusiasm is brought to our group meeting every year. So along the way, a lot of different infrastructure has been built, including facilities for biobanking, sample collection, processing. We've had to develop some new infrastructure with CAR-T work, and it's dizzy really what's happening. Now, strategic priorities, all of this has, guiding principles, of course. The big one is understanding cancer biology, which comes out of some of the infrastructure I was just talking about. Reducing the cancer burden. So that's a lot of what we're thinking about in our committee, because the burden of cancers goes beyond mortality, as we know, and just overall improving cancer care. And we are positioned next to a lot of industry trials, so we have to kind of think about, okay, what's our niche? And so what we set out to do is to address questions that are important to researchers, clinicians, and patients. And I want to highlight here, we have a very active patient representative committee. We met yesterday, is a very active member of that. She has a number of colleagues working across the various committees. And we want to evaluate interventions that are innovative, have the potential to change clinical practice. Really, in the idea, we want to answer questions that matter, right? And so we want to keep it really high caliber and all the way along, including patients as partners, and that's been a very strong thread the whole time I've been at CCTG, that's for sure. And so this was our plan for this past grant cycle, which ends next year, or well, two years. Understand cancer biology to improve cancer therapies, and there's a lot of activities that have been going on around that. I won't read all of those, you can see those. We want to reduce the burden of cancer and its treatment, and there's all kinds of ways that we're coming at that. That's a bucket for our committee to focus on for sure. But all the way along, demonstrating value in the work we're doing to improve cancer care. And so this red box is, of course, where the work of our committee primarily sits, but we aren't forgetting about the other ones as well. So, priority 2, that red box, what our strategic plan says is that we recognize that the patient's at the center of research, and that's important for clinical trials. It recognizes that the cancer experience represents all kinds of challenges, not just physical, but emotional and spiritual ones as well, that should be assessed and potentially improved. So you can see that's why we're here, right? It may not, to some people, CCTG 5 years ago, that made sense for us to be talking about CAN-PACT, but in 2025 it very definitely fits with what we're striving to do nowadays. And I would say, although we've always prioritized patient perspectives, I think it's kind of come even further up in things. And so, this is a really neat time in CCTG's history, in my view. So there's an elaborate sort of governance that goes with this. CCTG is based in Kingston and is based in Queens, really. So it has accountability to the Board of Trustees at Queens. CCTG itself has its own strategic executive advisory council. And of course, you've got central office in the middle there, as I was mentioning before. Connecting with that, you've got the Clinical Trials Committee, which is the body that reviews clinical trials concepts and gives feedback and ideally approves it. Not funding so much, although very occasionally, if it's a trial that does not require a lot of funding, there's core funding available, but for the most part, you have to find your own money when you're bringing a trials concept to that committee. And then, of course, there's the Data Safety Monitoring Committee, and then there's an executive committee as well. So this is just a list of all the various committees, and then underneath that, there's so-called endpoint committees. Quality of life is one of those. So, for example, the Quality of Life Committee does not run its own clinical trials, but it liaisons with all the trial committees, and you can see there are 11 of them there. We are at the bottom. You will see that supportive care is the only one that isn't tumor-centered, and our trials activity obviously spans all tumor sites, really, and so it involves a lot of conversations with the people doing the work elsewhere in the organization. And so all of these interact in various ways. One of the endpoint committees that we're trying to work out how to work with is the Correlative Science and Tumor Biology Committee. And I think there are opportunities. I mention that because it's something I'm wondering about with this project, right? And how can we leverage that community to do some translational work? I don't know, but it's just something to think about. We're looking for opportunities to partner with them. And some of the other committees I mentioned before, but there's a variety of sort of support committees. There's a pharmacy committee, there's a patient rep committee I mentioned before, there's a for radiation therapy studies or quality assurance. So this is really what the structure is, and it all meshes quite nicely together. There's a whole sort of series of steps that go on when somebody has a clinical trial idea. So there's the idea. Usually what happens is it's brought to our spring meeting, which is at the end of April or beginning of May every year, to a particular committee typically, and people will float the idea and see how much interest there is across the country because there's representatives from across the country in the room. If it is generally supported, then there will be further work after that to flesh out the proposal. Wei, whom you met earlier from the statistics group, or one of his colleagues will help with that, often get a sense of sample size and things. And then it'll often be brought back to the committee, or at least there's an executive for every committee for further discussion. And then it'll be taken forward to the clinical trials committee, and it might or might not be approved there. Sometimes it isn't, and then you can bring it back later. But once the trial is approved, then of course there's a question of funding, and as I mentioned, most often you have to find your own funding. And then once it's approved, then of course there's a whole series of steps, including getting a database set up and so on. And so it's a very robust path, and I think it's a really great system to harness for any trial in the cancer space that we might want to do. So the Supportive Care Committee itself, when are you going to step in here? You want me to keep going for a little bit?
When we talk about trials.
Okay, all right, keep going, okay. So originally it was a Symptom Control Committee in the 80s. Recently, it was reconceptualized.
Go back. First, the Supportive Care Committee.
It was Supportive Care to begin with, so
Yeah,
that was before my time. Then it became a
in 1980 it was Supportive Care.
And then it went back to supportive care?
Yeah. Just read the bullets and then.
Well, and interestingly, in the early days when it was the Supportive Care Committee's focus was on antibiotic trials for chemo.
Yeah.
Right, and that was what it was, because I remember going early on. Then it was symptom control, but recently, so you'll hear, it became Supportive Care all over again with an entirely different focus. We aren't talking about antibiotics with chemo anymore. And the focus of it right the way along has been on symptom relief, patient-reported outcome, but patient-reported outcome measures. So when I mention that, it highlights that we work very closely with the Quality of Life Committee. There's a natural fit between the two for sure, but we depend on them and they help us a little bit. And for a lot of the time I've been going there was a very strong engagement with radiation therapy, or radiation oncology, which has been great, but as you'll see, what's happened is we've branched out beyond that somewhat, as you'd imagine, since we're here. But this is the kind of trial that, and you know, from a radiation oncology perspective, practice changing. It looked at how many treatments you give to palliate the symptoms from incurable lung cancer. So very worthwhile study activity, and certainly working with radiation oncology is not something we want to abandon. But we're really happy we built out what we've done, or what we're doing. So these are some examples of some things that we learned in the radiation oncology world. So repeat treatment for painful bone metastasis with a single fraction is useful information. One of the things that we know is that if you give a single fraction of radiation therapy for painful bone metastasis, there can be pain flares. So we did a study that showed that giving dexamethasone reduced the probability of that. And the most recent one on this list was a study of stereotactic body treatment for spine metastases. So these are things that have been very, very helpful. And along the way, of course, this has led to collaboration with other groups within CCTG and outside of CCTG as well. And we've had correlative science sub-studies into these trials. Now, the scene began to shift a little bit with the SC26E's trial. And we'll talk a little bit about that maybe in a minute. But that sort of snuck its way in while we were doing all these radiation oncology trials. And that was because we were hoping to develop some partnerships with palliative care. And that was the first trial that actually got to open. We had a number of other trials that almost got there. So these are just to come back to these, the strategic priorities for the current grant cycle that we're on, but for our committee in particular. So we wanted to evaluate interventions for pain, fatigue, mental health symptoms at various points in the disease trajectory. We wanted to evaluate interventions to manage toxicities from treatment and symptom complexes arising from immunotherapy. We're still interested in that. We still want to evaluate the role of palliative radiation, so we haven't abandoned that. We want to apply a symptom science framework. We're hoping to strike those partnerships with basic science researchers and to strengthen palliative care research. As I was saying before, that's still something we're hoping to build out. And we're really keen, if we can at some point, not clear when it'll be possible, but to really try to advance a digital technology initiative in collaboration with the digital folks in the central office, but also the Quality of Life Committee. We haven't quite brought that to life yet, but really thinking about equity of rural and remote and also improving accrual to our trial, but most of all the patient experience participating in our trials. So it was renamed the Supportive Care Committee, and so what happened was, as we moved to get the grant that we're on right now, the reviewers looking at the grant submission we made made some comments, and basically they directed us to focus far more on other things. And so this is why we reconceptualized what we're doing. Which was a grant cycle before that, wasn't it? Yeah. So really, it's meant that we've recrafted our executive to reflect the agenda that we have, and that's why Linda's there, and Linda Valneves as well. And so we're now focusing far more on psychosocial oncology, and we have an interprofessional exec, which we didn't have before. It was all doctors all the time, pretty much. And not that that's bad, but it's meant that we've been able to consider some much more interesting ideas. And so this is sort of a visual of the various sort of trials that have gone through. Not all of them made it to prime time. Some never quite got there because there wasn't funding or there's some other logistical issues. Some are closed, obviously, but the ones that are open right now are the green boxes that you see there. That, I'm going to tell you, is a much more robust portfolio than we've had ever, do you think?
Maybe.
I think so. I mean, so we've been quite successful in opening up, we think, trials that matter. And we'll talk, Harriet's going to talk about a few of these, just to give you an idea of what we're up to. I won't spend a lot of time going through this slide. So, emerging themes. So, trial interventions, what we're hoping to do is start to really work.
Kirk Mugford, please return to the unit. Kirk Mugford, return to the unit.
We want to start really focusing on working with our young colleagues who are just joining the clinical trials world. And so we do have the ability to have early investigators do practicums, and we've had a couple come through working with our committee in particular. So that's been exciting. So we're growing a new generation of trialists with an interest in supportive care, which is really great. We are trying to focus on this immunotherapy body of work that I mentioned before. So we have a trial concept in the work looking at that, a medication called vedolizumab to prevent colitis, which is common in immunotherapy. So we're working with a gastroenterologist in Calgary on that. And we're also hoping to branch out and work with colleagues in Australia. So SC26 is the trial I mentioned before. So it's a psychosocial intervention to support patients having bone marrow transplant for leukemia. It's a randomized trial comparing that versus standard care. And I don't know whether the Australians have their grant yet, do they? They don't. I was talking to Brian Kelly, who is here, about that. He knew something about that group. So we're really hoping to build out partnerships with Australia, long story short. And we're really working hard to kind of leverage new trial designs. So Harry's going to speak a little bit about that, but we have a smart design in SC31. We've had virtual designs for a couple of the other trials that we've done. We have quite an interesting concept that we haven't funded yet called Sopranos, which is really coming at a symptom management framework kind of approach with basic science. And so with a digital component as well, so we're hoping that'll be funded. One of the things that's under development at the moment is it's really just a single arm trial that taking what you may know as a SPARK questionnaire, social determinants of health, contextualizing that for cancer clinical trials patients, and then trialing that and seeing how acceptable that is for patients on our trial. So that's going to be starting, we think, probably, it might be a bit optimistic, something like that. And you're going to take over now, are you?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right, so we'll try to give you the names of all these trials now, because I know when you just see SC everywhere, like, what is that? So I'm just going to quickly sort of highlight some of the trials that we've either recently concluded or are ongoing, and maybe give you some insights. I mean, they're not always straightforward and they can be quite challenging. So these are really examples of some of our more patient-centered studies that we've developed in partnership with the Supportive Care Committee and our investigator community. So CO21 is a phase 3 study of the impact of our physical activity program on disease-free survival in patients with high-risk stage 2 or 3 colon cancer, called the Challenge Trial. And I will just say that this trial originated in the Symptom Control Committee. We actually had brought together a think tank to address extreme fatigue in patients following chemotherapy from colorectal cancer. And we brought people like Carrie Corneyer, who's an expert in exercise, physical activity interventions, to Toronto to sort of brainstorm what might be the best design. And in the end, we landed on a physical activity intervention. But fast forward, the GI group kind of took it over because they decided, oh, not only could exercise be great, potentially a really important intervention for fatigue, but it might equally impact disease-free survival, maybe even overall survival. And so it actually got really scaled up into a much bigger trial. And so essentially 800, it was originally about a little over 900 patients were, it was powered, the trial was powered with about 900 patients. And they were stratified either into a structured exercise, physical exercise program with some behavioral support sessions, or just general health education material. So they were, they essentially had sort of supervised structured exercise program for about a year, and then for the next 2 years, they were they were supposed to continue with this physical activity. It took a long time to complete this study, but it just got completed and we just published in the New England Journal of Medicine this year. So hugely successful trial, but yeah, it took 15 years to accrue 889 patients to the trial. But what we did observe was quite a significant difference in disease-free survival. So about 28% improved survival in disease-free survival in those who were randomized to the intervention arm, and in fact the overall survival was even stronger. So about 37% overall survival benefit for those patients in the exercise intervention arm. There are additional secondary endpoints. We are going to be looking at fatigue, and we've collected biomarkers, serum to look at cytokine activity to see if we can correlate that with fatigue. I will say we didn't restrict this trial in the end to patients who were struggling with chronic fatigue. It ended up being open to all patients. So we didn't see a signal with fatigue in the overall quality of life scales, but we're going to try to do a sub-study focusing on those patients who might have come into the trial with more higher levels of fatigue and see if there's a difference. We see a change in fatigue in that subpopulation over time. The ST26 is emotion and symptom focused engagement. So
You might have put the batteries, or did you hit something?
I don't know, it's still green.
I don't know, it must be the batteries.
That's right. I'll turn that off and I'll go with this one.
Yeah, I'll change the batteries.
So you heard a little bit earlier yesterday, Gary Rodin's, I think, developed the CALM intervention, I believe, as one potential. Yeah, so this is sort of similar but different enough that it warrants a phase 3 trial to compare the ease. Well, I'll show you what that trial about that. It's basically looking at an early psychosocial intervention for patients with newly diagnosed acute leukemia who are currently in hospital, and it's also combined with a early palliative care intervention. So those patients that are randomized to the psychosocial intervention will also complete ESAS scales twice a week, and if they get over 4 on pain or other items, this will trigger a referral to palliative care. And so the endpoints of the trial are really to look at both distress and also functional pain. So there are a number of items that are being used, or instruments that are being used to measure a variety of outcomes, and we're capturing all this information on using Sprout, which is an electronic patient-reported outcome system that we've developed at CCTG, so patients can enter their quality of life and other symptom data directly through an iPad or through a pen and do it at home on their computer. This study was centrally activated in 2020, but there was a bit of a COVID effect, and we really couldn't get into the hospitals and start accruing patients or inviting patients to participate until closer to 2022. So nevertheless, it's still taking a little bit longer than anticipated to accrue to this trial, which we're seeing in a lot of these psychosocial trials that we're running. But we're about 100 short, so it's still ongoing, and we're hoping to complete accrual by next year. But I would say 2 of the things that have sort of affected accrual would be certainly COVID, and then delayed local activation for a number of our centers. And the other was just the time it takes to train and credential therapists who are going to deliver the EASE intervention. So they need to work with 2 patients who are trained. They have to train on 2 patients, before they can be credentialed to actually start recruiting patients into the trial. So that has certainly delayed referral. As you can see, Princess Margaret Hospital, where Gary Rodin and Camilla Zimmerman are the 2 co-chairs, are sort of leading the way in accruals. But Kingston is doing really well. We're small but mighty. So I'm sure if you're involved in that, Danielle, but yay! Thank you. The Seamless study you probably also has been referenced briefly. This is a randomized multi-site waitlist control trial of smartphone app-based mindfulness intervention for cancer survivors. This was funded through both the CIHR, and CCTG was able to match that funding by providing per case funding. So we do have sometimes a small envelope of funding for per case funding, and I would say our supportive care trials are good candidates for that envelope of funding because we typically don't receive industry funding, and so we're often like the poor cousin of the other disease sites that get big, glamorous trial funding from industry. Linda Carlson is obviously the study chair for this trial. So briefly, the Seamless trial aims to decrease post-treatment cancer-related side effects in a broad range of survivors, using a sort of a low-cost, evidence-based, mindfulness-based cancer recovery journey program that's being delivered through a smartphone mobile application that can be used by survivors in their own home. And we really want to understand, if it does work, what are the mechanisms by which it works, and is it sort of equally effective, for example, in males and men compared to females and women in subgroups of cancer survivors. So the primary study objectives for this trial, which sample size is 345, is to evaluate the effectiveness of this journey on symptoms of stress, to evaluate the effectiveness of this journey on anxiety, depression, fatigue, and overall physical functioning and quality of life. And then to test a theoretical mediation model, to understand the treatment effects and disentangle the mechanisms of action. And then there are some exploratory study objectives as well. The recruitment and study team, some of the partners involved in this trial include Mobio, who I think have helped you work closely with, right, develop the app. We even got some funding to translate the intervention in the app as well. And then recruitment methods include, well, really Linda's using the Provincial Cancer Registry here in Alberta. I think the rest of the sites are using more standard in-clinic recruitment and there's some self-referral. So the funding model, for the most part, is what we call per patient funding or per case funding, except for the additional 145 patients that Linda was recruiting through the Alberta Cancer Registry, which is why she is dominating accrual in this trial right now. But then she has to slow down and let some of the other centers who recently
a mail out going next week.
who recently so some of these other centers have literally just got activated like in this last year, and so they're just. We just got Fredericton too?
Yeah, we're just waiting on the final approvals for e-consent.
Okay, great, okay. Yes, and this is a trial that is using e-consent, so which can be sometimes tricky to get through some of the REBs from some of the sites that are participating. The last trial I'm just going to highlight is what I call it TEMPO, which is, or SC31. It's a tailored, dyadic, web-based psychosocial and physical activity self-management program for men with prostate cancer and their caregivers. So this is really one of the first trials we're doing, which is looking at dyads and interventions that can potentially support both patients and their caregivers. And Dr. Sylvie Lambert from McGill University is leading this project study. So the main goals of this TEMPO intervention are to provide support that cancer patients and their caregivers need to self-manage the multitude of physical and psychosocial challenges caused by cancer, related treatments, and post-treatment recovery, which are all important priorities for patient-centered cancer care. Some of the quotes from some of the caregivers. At the hospital, we are nothing, but I do not understand because if we were not there, everything would fall apart. So that's a direct quote from a caregiver. And often the sense is that we're not doing enough to support the caregivers in the journey. So the TEMPO is developed for men with prostate cancer and their caregivers to increase men's and their caregivers' repertoire of self-management skills to address key psychosocial challenges, to increase or maintain physical activities so they can meet guideline recommendations. And essentially what happens is the dyads will identify 1 or 2 cancer-related challenges from a list of 49 that are part of this program, educational program that Sylvie and her team have already developed. And these items will help them learn about self-management and it might be contributory towards them feeling anxious. So for each challenge, there are 3 to 4 self-management skills that are suggested, with physical activity always emphasized to enhance health. And to support the behavior change inherent in self-management, these dyads will complete modules. So there's a bit of homework involved on their goal setting, what their action planning is, and how are they self-monitoring. And then coaching can be added to provide an additional nudge to help those who are struggling with completing these modules or their homework. I think I'd be a coach. So this is the sort of general schema. Patients are originally randomized to either receiving TEMPO or standard of care, and anxiety is measured at 11 weeks. So essentially they're screened based on their ESAS scores for entry into the trial, and then we're using the HADS to look at some reasonable, meaningful change in anxiety at 11 weeks. For those that have not had meaningful change, they will be further randomized to receiving coaching or continuing on TEMPO, and then anxiety will be measured again at 22 weeks. And then those in the control arm who have not sort of their anxiety has not improved would be then receive the tempo. So this is a sample size of 376 dyads, and we're planning to activate it at the end of this year. So just to summarize, what are the lessons that we've learned? We've learned that lifestyle and psychosocial intervention trials are associated with different complexities than mounting a radiotherapy trial or a trial using maybe more classic cancer drugs. It requires different platforms and network of investigators. Sometimes our clinical trial units that are sort of embedded as our member centers aren't the best units to work with to launch these trials. And so as a result, rapid accrual to some of these trials can be challenging at major cancer sites. So you really need committed champions at each site and at each one of these clinical trial units. Thus, this sort of potential requirement to expand our network within the cancer centers. So I've been over time, but thank you so much for your attention and listening. And happy to take any questions, or maybe after, if you want to do.
Well, we could have a couple of minutes because there's a little bit of a buffer built in.
Okay.
And I guess my question, is okay, so we're going to hopefully use this network for CAN-PACT and doing our large clinical trial. What do you see as some of the stumbling blocks there?
Well, I mean, I think it's first it's sort of educating really the changing the culture at CTG. And
So we should say we already presented it once to the Clinical Trials Committee.
yes,
And
we
it
did.
didn't get passed.
And it didn't get passed. So, yes, but I would say that there was a lot of really enthusiastic discussion at that CTC meeting when it was presented. And some of the
I wasn't there.
What was their hang up? Was it design?
design. So there were actual folks in the room. Some of the reviewers like, I want to be on this trial. Like, so it wasn't complete, resistance. And I think, I think climate is changing. But I think at the time they were skeptical about how you would screen for demoralization because it's not something that's typically screened in oncology cancer wards. And there wasn't like a sort of a rapid screening tool that was available. The other concern, and I don't know how we're going to really resolve it, is the comparison arm, that you can't blind it. And so there was real, I think, divergence of opinions on that. So,
And low dose wasn't sufficient.
low dose was not sufficient because there's too much evidence to show that they know.
And niacin isn't sufficient.
We
weren't proposing that.
We weren't proposing niacin. So those are the things that can't give cannabis. So those were, I think, two of the main sticking points. And I guess also didn't have funding at the time, but that's not a major hurdle. I think they'll often
We
approve
have
things.
funding now, so we'll
Yeah.
take our money. Actually.
Yeah.
I'd like to have the culture in the cancer center too. I was really interested in Dr. Bach's comment that oncologists refused to have their patients enter the trial, so they had to get patients from other cancer centers. So I think it's going to be an interesting process to acculturate this amongst my oncology colleagues,
Yeah.
depending on the center, of course, because I think they could definitely try and get some way.
I think you'll have some centers that might be really supportive,
Yeah.
and you're going to have others that are going to be resistant.
Yeah.
So, I
We'll have to
mean,
do some work.
yeah, exactly.
All right. I think we should probably carry on.
Okay.
Thank you.